The problem of having a lack of willpower and poor impulse control is an ancient one, and in fact the ancient Greeks even had a word for this, akrasia. But it's actually become a much bigger problem in modern time. The obesity researcher Stephen Guyenet explains how this works with an example from geese. I'm going to paraphrase his explanation, but I'll keep a link to the original post in the description. This is a pattern of behavior noticed by the scientist Konrad Lorenz. And what he noticed is that these geese who make their eggs on the ground would sometimes have their eggs roll out of their nest. And when that happened, they would just roll them right back in. And what Lorenz did is he took a larger, more perfectly round, and more bright white object and placed it outside of the nest. And what he found was that the geese would ignore their own eggs and roll these fake eggs back into their nest. And so he called this a superstimulus. Geese have this instinct that says, roll round white things back into the nest. But when they had their somewhat drab, somewhat oblong white thing next to this larger, whiter, rounder white thing, then their brains went straight for the superstimulus and ignored their own real eggs. Now, Stephen Guyenet is an obesity researcher. What he wants to know is why people are getting fatter and fatter. Now, there are a lot of theories about why people are getting fatter and fatter on the internet. I'm not here to try and take you away from yours. But his theory is not that it's sugar or not that it's fat, but that overall we have learned to concentrate sugar and fat and make food more and more rewarding so that it hits the dopamine systems in our brain harder and harder. And so the basic idea is we have this instinct that says fruit is good and healthy because it's got sugar, so eat fruit. But when you concentrate the sugar and fat and you put it into an Oreo, that same instinct gets hijacked the exact same way the geese's instinct is hijacked. We ignore fruit and we eat Oreos. And our brain can regulate our appetite based on eating fruit. It'll say, oh, I had enough, I'm not hungry anymore. But when it's Oreos, you find a little bit more room and you keep eating, and overall you get more and more overweight. And this is a general problem with modern life. Our bodies produce many natural opioids that make us feel good when we do things like exercise, or have a pleasant conversation with a friend, listen to music we enjoy, or accomplish something at work or school. So those opioids are our body's reward system that tells us to go out and live a flourishing and productive life. But drugs like heroin can concentrate those opioids and give us a much stronger dose of that good feeling. So just like the geese ignored their real eggs for the superstimuli, and we ignore fruit for the superstimuli of Oreos, we also ignore pleasant conversations and productive working for the superstimuli of drugs like heroin. Another way of putting it is that we live in an evolutionarily novel environment. We're designed for fruit, but have donuts and ice cream and Oreos. We're designed for satisfying work and pleasant conversation, but have heroines. So our willpower is strong enough to handle fruit, but not Oreos or heroin. Technology was supposed to solve our problems, but instead it's created new ones. Now, these new problems are clearly smaller problems than what we used to have. I would much rather have to worry about becoming overweight by eating Oreos than I would about starving to death because there's not enough food to eat. But we have to realize that technology is not going to give us utopia. My favorite example of a supernormal stimuli is the Australian jewel beetle. In a very peculiar turn of events, a type of beer bottle known as a stubby looks like a female jewel beetle. So the females have brown bodies with textured bumps on them, and the stubby is a brown bottle with textured bumps on it. So the stubby gives out a stronger brown thing with textured bumps signal than the female beetles. And so the result was comical. The male beetles would try to mate with the beer bottles and ignore the real females. This actually got to be such a major problem that the jewel beetle was in danger of going extinct, but fortunately the manufacturer of the stubby changed their bottle design to a green bottle and the problem went away and the jewel beetles were saved. Daryl Gwynn and David Rentz, who did the research on the jewel beetle, were awarded the 2011 Ig Nobel Prize for their research. Their research is a textbook example of the Ig Nobel Prize because it's given to strange and comical research that might not normally get attention. But the best Ig Nobels teach surprisingly deep lessons, and this is a perfect example of that. So the jewel beetles aren't that different than humans. There are millions of failing marriages because the husband is chasing a superstimuli, pornography, while ignoring their wives. Pornography has been around forever, but there's a big difference between the stack of Playboy magazines that my friends and I used to try and sneak when we were teenagers compared to the unlimited 4K video that's available on everyone's phone. Pornography is like alcohol and other drugs. Most people can drink in moderation and not become addicted. But for those who are not so lucky, alcohol can literally ruin their lives and the lives of their family. So for men who are addicted to pornography, it can lead to erectile difficulty and unwanted fetishes. But for women, the consequences are more harmful. Most men who are addicted to porn are too ashamed to tell their wives, but at least they know what's going on. The women who are trapped in sexless marriages are left wondering what they did wrong. Does her husband no longer find her attractive? Has he fallen out of love? Is there another woman? The problem of pornography is getting so bad that you're even starting to see some signs on the left that maybe uninhibited sexuality is not quite the wonderful thing that Wilhelm Reich and the Frankfurt School thought it might be. The New York Times had an article called "The Troubling Trend in Teenage Sex," and it shares research showing that 2/3 of college women in the United States have been choked during sex. And it documents the rise of choking through shows and movies like Californication, 50 Shades of Grey, and the HBO series Euphoria. And in the song "Lovin' on Me," Jack Harlow raps that, "I'm vanilla baby, I'll choke you, but I ain't no killer baby." So choking has now become a vanilla part of sex. One of the many mysteries of leftism that I find completely astonishing is that the left hates Andrew Tate, but is pro-porn. I feel like I have to do the Office meme where Pam makes Creed find the difference between two pictures, and then after she walks out of the room, she says, they're the same picture. Andrew Tate was arrested because he, at least allegedly, was grooming women into becoming OnlyFans models for pornography. And so the stuff on pornography is exactly the stuff of Andrew Tate's life. And Andrew Tate is just one of many, many men who have been grooming and trafficking women into pornography and prostitution. It's a huge problem in the entire industry. In the previous video on Populist Conservatism number 6, we looked at how leftists have been arguing for the sexual revolution, and we looked at Mary Wollstonecraft, who wanted to empower women, in part on the clearly misguided method of abolishing marriage, on her belief that marriage was a way of entrapping women and taking agency away from women. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and now feminists are arguing that being choked is empowering for women, and that women who don't like being choked are stuck-up prudes. And that's exactly the point that the New York Times article made about the women who did not want to be choked. So as a society, we've reached the point where kink shaming is bad, but vanilla shaming is perfectly acceptable in ways that are highly degrading to women, and yet feminists defend this. However, I do have to point out that although I'm not a fan of the Frankfurt School and I'm not a fan of critical theory, Herbert Marcuse would not be going along with this. He would be saying that this is a textbook example of how in a capitalist world we've replaced one form of oppression with a new form of oppression. But unfortunately, most leftists are not as self-aware as Herbert Marcuse. Now let's switch gears a little bit. If Alicia likes chocolate ice cream and Blake likes vanilla, then there's no rational argument that you can use to prove that one of them is right. Or, to choose a somewhat more loaded example, if Alicia likes pineapple on pizza and Blake thinks it's a crime against humanity, then no matter how much fun they have debating this, there's no rational argument that you can use to prove that one of them is right. It's just a matter of opinion. And these opinions are ultimately based on feelings, or, as philosophers used to put it, passions. And so now it's time to add another philosopher to our list of leftist intellectuals, and that's the famous Enlightenment skeptic David Hume. So he takes this concept to its logical conclusion and very famously said, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." In other words, if you like chocolate ice cream, the only role for reason is to get you more chocolate ice cream. Hume marks a very sharp break from most philosophers in both the ancient and medieval and early modern traditions who based morality on a sense of virtue and self-discipline. But that's what the Enlightenment was all about, or at least that's what the latter half of the Enlightenment was all about, was challenging these old traditions because they couldn't figure out why they might be right. I've already talked about Chesterton's fence, I think back in Populist Conservatism number 1, but here's a quick refresher. The parable goes like this. Someone is walking along and he sees a fence seemingly in the middle of nowhere, and he says, "I don't see the purpose of this fence, let's get rid of it." And his companion says to him, "If you don't see the purpose of this fence, then the last thing you should do is get rid of it. What you need to do is figure out what the purpose is. Then when you understand why this fence is there, then we can talk about getting rid of it." And the main idea is that every tradition is a solution to a problem that we no longer remember. And if you get rid of the solution, then you're going to create the problem again, and we're going to have to face it. Unfortunately, to be a leftist is to flat out ignore the lesson of Chesterton's fence, so intellectuals like David Hume challenged all our old insights about reason working in opposition to the passions. And if David Hume's insight that reason ought only to be a slave to the passion seems like something that a snarky high school student wouldn't come up with, well, you're not wrong. When I was in high school, one of the boys in my circle of friends started joining the stoners who snuck off to the river to smoke pot. Because I'm pretty old, and back in my day there was a big stigma against smoking pot, so you had to go someplace very far away in order to smoke it. And me and another one of my friends, we couldn't figure out why he did this, and the best explanation we could come up with was our slogan, "Feels good? Might as well do it." But we meant this slogan sarcastically. It was so obviously wrong to us that no one should ever take it actually at face value. But then we both went off to college, and at that point we had succumbed to temptation and started dabbling in pot and other drugs, and we started to say, "Feels good, might as well do it," non-ironically. And it took us a long time to recover the wisdom of the ancient philosophers. Now, Hume did not actually say that we should all start doing drugs, because people have many passions, and some of these passions conflict with each other. Take the popular meme, "I want a hot body, but I also want a taco." Now, how do you trade off between these two goals? Hume's literary style doesn't let us do this, or, more accurately, his literary style lets us do this in a way that blunts the harm of his radical and skeptical ideology. However, luckily for us, and unluckily for David Hume, his insight is now baked into modern economics, and modern economics has become quite mathematical. And this allows us to make this trade-off between hot bodies and tacos in a mathematically rigorous way. And a little spoiler warning, David Hume does not come off too well in this. Here's how modern economics does it. This is the rational utility maximizer model. Basically, the essence of it is that people can create a ranked list of preferences. And the items at the top of this list grant more utility than the items at the bottom of this list. Now, you're allowed to have your preferences evolve over time. Maybe once you liked chocolate, but now you've started to prefer vanilla. But it can't change in wild or unpredictable or chaotic ways. And if that does happen, then it's called a preference reversal, which is the hallmark of irrational behavior. So now that you understand the gist, let's take a look at the model of the rational drug addict, which was created by the libertarians Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy. And at an intuitive level, this basically takes Hume's idea to heart. It says that drug addicts freely choose the poor health, the damaged relationships, and the disappointing lives that come because the high of taking drugs is just that good. So this is sort of the left's vision of freedom taken to its complete apotheosis. The ultimate in freedom is that which gets you the highest, most powerful pleasures, and so the ultimate of freedom is becoming a drug addict. Now, if you are at all conservative by nature, I'm sure your disgust mechanisms, your internal disgust mechanisms, are recoiling just at the description of this, but the mere fact that it triggers our disgust mechanisms is enough to know that you shouldn't follow it, but it's not enough to refute it in the public square of public information and public reason. So let's do that. Let's start by recognizing that the model of the rational drug addict does have some upsides. So the first lesson of economics is that people respond to incentives, and drug addicts are no exception. Henry Saffer and Frank Jalupka used data from the National Household Survey of Drug Abuse, and they find that drug legalization would result in a 100% increase in the use of heroin and a 50% increase in cocaine. So behaviors that are punished are done less often, behaviors that are rewarded are done more often. If we remove the punishment for doing drugs by legalizing, people will do drugs more often. However, the model of the rational drug addict does not withstand a closer look. And the reason for this is that drug addicts are probably the exact same way you and I are when we think about choices we'd like to make in our life. We resolve to go to the gym, but we stay home and watch TV. We resolve to eat more fruits and vegetables and reach for the potato chips and ice cream. And drug addicts are exactly the same way. They resolve to quit doing drugs, but then keep doing drugs again. I once asked my stepmother if she ever planned to quit smoking, and her answer as a pack-a-day smoker was 20 times a day. In other words, she'd smoke a cigarette, plan to quit, and then an hour later reach for another cigarette, and then plan to quit again. Now, she did ultimately quit smoking, but her answer shows exactly how the human brain works when it comes to these superstimuli. You can think about it this way. When you eat a donut, you're being kind to your present self, the you who exists right now in the present. Your present self gets to enjoy a tasty snack. On the other hand, eating a donut is unkind to the future you, the you who will exist tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. Your future self doesn't get to enjoy the tasty benefits of eating a donut, but it does have to live with the higher degree of fatness that came with it. Similarly, when you go to the gym to exercise, you're being mean to your present self, the you who exists now. So your present self has to undergo the discomfort of exercise, the physical discomfort and the hassle and the headache, and having to forego something that might be more pleasant, like watching TV. But you're being kind to your future self, the future you who will exist tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. The psychologist George Ainsley points out that this is a form of intertemporal bargaining. In other words, it's a bargaining between the you who lives today, the you who lives tomorrow, the you who lives the day after that, and so on. So all things being equal, you would like your future yous to be physically fit and have the health benefits of eating a healthy diet. But you don't want to be the only sucker. So if you're going to eat healthy today and go to the gym today, you don't want the you in the future to say, I'm just going to stay home. So there's this implicit bargaining process. And that's why establishing momentum is so important for successful diets and exercise regimes. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So if you can get a streak started, then all of a sudden you can feel more confident that your future yous are going to keep it going. But if you've been lazy for a long time and have no momentum, then even if you succeed in dragging yourself to the gym, you can't be sure that your future yous will make the same decision. And if you don't think your future yous will make the same decision, then there's no point in the present you making the same decision. And so this takes us back to the marshmallow test from the previous video, Populist Conservatism number 6. In the marshmallow test, children were given a choice. They could eat one marshmallow now, or if they could wait 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, they could then have a second marshmallow as a reward. So their present self would get one marshmallow, but their future self would get 2 marshmallows. And so that's really what's going on with the marshmallow test. And so here's the key thing. Economists can model this dynamic mathematically. And in fact, it's pretty straightforward. It follows the exact same math, essentially, as bank accounts and interest rates. So think about it this way. Suppose you had the choice between 2 options. You can have $1,000 today, or you could have $1,100 a year from now. So that gives you 2 choices. The choice of which one you would pick depends on how heavily you discount the future. Suppose you only discount the future by 5%. Then in that case, $1,100 discounted by 5% works out to about $1,047 today. So if you have the choice between $1,000 today or $1,047 today, then you would choose the $1,047. So you would choose $1,100 in the future because it gives you more utility today than the money today does. Now imagine that you discount the future by 15%. So that means you put a greater weight on your present well-being than you do on your future well-being compared to that earlier scenario. If you discount the future by 15%, $1,100 a year from now is only worth $956 today. And so in that case, you would choose $1,000 today, not $1,100 a year from now. Now the math for this is very simple. You can just look up the discount formulas. It's just whatever the money is divided by 1 plus the discount rate. But the key takeaway is that the less you discount the future, the more you make changes that benefit you in the future. And the more you live in the present, the more you make changes that hurt you in the future. Now what Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy did with their model of the rational drug addict is they showed that you could rationally choose your present high of doing drugs over your future well-being for not doing drugs and having healthy relationships and good health. And if that seems obviously wrong, keep in mind you do have to discount the future at least a little bit, otherwise that would be irrational. And here's just a really loaded example to give you an insight into why. Suppose you decided to live your life as a complete miser. You didn't spend your money on anything whatsoever. And you did this so that you could invest your money and therefore take advantage of compounding interest and have all that money later on in your life. And then, finally, on your last day of work, when you're ready to retire and live off all that money that you made, you get hit by a bus and die. So the future has uncertainty available, so you can't always postpone your present happiness for future happiness. At some point, you do have to actually live with and enjoy your money. And so what Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy showed is, with this understanding of human nature, you can be a rational drug addict. However, there's a very important flaw in their model. And remember that rationality means having a stable list of preferences that don't change. So this would mean that drug addicts would be saying, yes, I've destroyed my bodily health. Yes, I've destroyed my relationships. Yes, I've lost my career, which used to give me meaning and purpose, but it's worth it because the high is just that good. But that's not actually what's going on with drug addicts. Drug addicts resolve to quit and break their resolution. It's just like the story of my stepmom, who planned to quit 20 times a day and then broke that resolution. Or the case of people who plan to go to the gym but then find an excuse to stay home. So these broken resolutions are preference reversals, which are fundamentally irrational behavior. And here's the kicker. We can model these preference reversals mathematically as well. So instead of using an exponential discount function, we would use a hyperbolic discount function. And hyperbolic discounting gets us exactly what we see with the drug addicts who resolve to quit but then have a preference reversal and take drugs again, and then resolve to quit and have a preference reversal and take drugs, and get trapped in this cycle of preference reversals. And in fact, there's a second, even deeper problem, which is Becker and Murphy use data drawn from the real world about prices for drugs built into their model. But those prices are based on people with a hyperbolic discount functioning choosing their prices. So even to get their model of exponential discounting to work, they had to use data that was drawn from people with hyperbolic discounting. So they kind of smuggled in some hyperbolic assumptions into their exponential model. And the empirical research does confirm this. Shane Frederick and his colleagues have shown that hyperbolic discounting is a better model for drug addicts than exponential discounting, as has George Ainsley in some of his work. So David Hume got it exactly backwards. Reason is, and ought to be, the master of our passions. However, there is a problem with this. So our passions, our desires, they come from a part of the brain called the limbic system, which is a robust and well-developed part of the brain. However, our impulse control comes from the prefrontal cortex, which is where the higher reasoning parts of the brain, where that happens. And our prefrontal cortex is not always up to the job of reining in our limbic system so we can plan for the future. And that's particularly true in our modern world that is filled with superstimuli, such as Oreos and heroin. It may have been up to the job in our more ancestral environments where we lived as simple farmers or hunter-gatherers, but not so much in our modern world. And so that takes us once again to the difference between the liberal and the conservative vision of freedom. So you could think of the liberal vision of freedom as saying life is just too hard, doing all this planning for the future, having to control your impulses. This is all just a lot of anxiety, a lot of repression, and none of this is good. Let's just let it all go. Let's eat the Oreos, let's take the drugs, let's have the promiscuous sex, and then we can truly be free, rather than trying to regulate these appetites and being repressed and having all sorts of problems. So that's the liberal vision of freedom, and I think the best statement of the conservative vision came from the philosopher Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was really one of the first modern conservatives. And one of the important things about Edmund Burke is he was actually a lifelong reformer himself. He had been a frequent critic of King George. He was a member of the reform-oriented Whig Party, and he had defended the American colonists in their revolution. But he very famously came out against the French Revolution in his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And one of the seeds of the idea of that book emerged in one of the letters he wrote to a member of the French National Assembly, so a letter to one of the French revolutionaries. And in this letter, he was basically arguing that the French people were not capable of freedom. And here's what he wrote. Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites, in proportion as their love to justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption, in proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and good, in preference to the flattery of knaves. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more of it there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. And so, there you have it. Hume says that reason should be a slave to the passions, and Burke says that the passions enslave us. This division is the single biggest fault line probably between the right and the left. Now, Hume, in fairness, did have some conservative impulses, but I think his skepticism, both about the importance of social norms and about reason, and his more general skepticism towards religion and God, ultimately put him on the left. And I think it's pretty clear that conservatives have the upper hand in this debate. We've seen it with the marshmallow test, despite the efforts of the left to undermine it. We've seen it with the harms of pornography to the point where now feminists are cheering on women being choked as empowering. And we've seen it with the model of the rational drug addict. This fault line between the left and the right will continue to be a running theme throughout the rest of this video series. In the next video, we're going to return to the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, and we're going to look at the third assumption, which is the assumption that people's actions do not hurt others, even indirectly. And what we'll find from this assumption is that this is actually what really drives social conservatism, even more than this second assumption that people choose rationally. However, before we get to that point, we're going to see that the left uses this assumption to drive the environmental movement, and that's the main reason why we can't build anything today. That's why we can't build railroads today, we can't build skyscrapers today, we can't even build the nuclear power plants that would have taken care of the global warming problem back in the 1970s. And it's all because the left used a theoretical justification for government intervention in the economy and ran with it to the point where nothing can be built.